Hey guys, it's Ms. D, and I'm going to go over our first new topic, which is U.S. imperialism. I've broken this up into 5 different videos. This first video for my students who had global last year is going to be a review of everything you learned last year, because imperialism, whether it's committed by England or committed by America, obviously it's going to have things in common. So a lot of this is going to sound familiar. For my students who are in the U.S. film class, this is all new. So, let's get this ball rolling. All right, so the first thing you need to know about imperialism is what the heck is imperialism? And it's pretty basic. Imperialism is basically when a stronger nation gains control over a weaker nation. All right, so please know that definition. Imperialism is when a stronger nation gains control over a weaker nation. And I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I don't know how a weaker nation would gain control of a stronger nation. Let's be real. But anyway, so like a big bully, big strong nation says, we're going to gain control of you. We're going to take over. And why would they do that? Well, I mean, obviously, because they want something from you, right? Why else are you going to bother doing it? So you gain control over a weaker nation and you get stuff. So what kind of stuff do you get? Well, like with any major topic in history, it usually breaks down into 3 things, right? Economic, political, social. So why do you imperialize? For economic reasons, for political reasons, and for social reasons. So let's get started, all right? First, economic. Why do you imperialize? Because it's going to make you money, all right? And how does it make you money? Well, when you gain control over a weaker nation, you get access to their raw materials. So you can force them to grow certain agricultural crops or what have you, access to whatever. And they are going to be forced to sell that to you for really cheap. You get access to their products. So, for example, America wants to, have control over Hawaii or gain control over Cuba. Why? Because they make sugar, and sugar is a raw material. It's wicked expensive. It's, worth a lot of money. And if you gain control over that country, you force them to sell the sugar to you for really cheap. All right. Then the other thing that a colony can do is be a market for your goods. So what I mean by market? Well, when you go to the supermarket, right? What happens at a supermarket? Things are bought and sold. Well, what happens is when you have a colony, you can force the colony to buy from you. You are the stronger nation. You force the weaker nation to buy your goods. And so this may sound familiar. I mean, you have a colony, right? And if you remember back at the beginning of this year, we talked about England being, that England was the mother country and America was its colony. And, we talked about colonization. Imperialism and colonization are basically the same thing. There's really no difference. The same way we had to buy goods from England and England made lots of money from America. That and imperialism are basically the same thing. The only difference is, for purposes of the regents, they often refer to colonies that are created after the Industrial Revolution as imperialism. That's the only difference, because now that you have all these factories that come out of the Industrial Revolution are producing more goods. So you have more goods to sell. And you need more raw materials to use in your factories. So the pressure to have colonies kind of increases after the Industrial Revolution. So that's the only reason for the different names. But it's the same difference. You have colonies and you make them buy your stuff and you make them sell you their raw materials. All right. So number 1, why do you imperialize? Because it's going to make you money. How does it make you money? Raw materials, new markets. So that's the economic. Let's move on to the political reasons why you imperialize. And again, now that we're out of the Industrial Revolution, you start having more modern navies. And these modern navies use, it's not like the olden days we had sailboats. You now have steamships. And these steamships use up a lot of coal. Now, you've driven with your parents, right? You're in the car and suddenly I go, oh, I'm out of gas. Let me pull over to the gas station and fill up. You're in the middle of the, Pacific Ocean. You can't pull in to the Shell station. You can't stop at 7-Eleven for what you need. You're in the middle of nowhere. So what happens is having colonies in strategic locations, especially, like in Asia or in the middle of the Pacific or what have you, in these really critical strategic areas, it becomes really important to have colonies. That way you have a place to set up a naval base. That way you always have your ships available in all over the world, and you know that your ship can dock there and it can refuel, okay? In addition, having a big colonial empire is a sign of global power and prestige. It basically, only powerful countries have a global empire. So if you want to be looking as like a big shot, you have to have it. I mean, it's the same thing. You ever see like an award show, right? You have all these musicians and they got to walk into the award show dripping with jewelry and designer clothes and all this fancy stuff. Does that have anything to do with how well they sing? No, they could walk in jeans and a t-shirt and it doesn't change the sound of their voice. Nobody cares. But at the end of the day, they have to look the part, right? They have to flash lots of jewelry. They have to flash the fancy clothing. That way people say, ooh, you're a big shot. Ooh, you get what I'm saying? It gives them that prestige. So it's the same thing. A nation isn't going to wear jewelry or drive a fancy car. Instead, to show how powerful it is, to show what a big shot it is, it's going to gain colonies. All right. So why do you imperialize? For economic reasons. Why? You need raw materials and new markets. What are some of the political reasons you need or military reasons why you need colonies? Because for naval bases and for your global prestige or power. The last thing is social reasons and kind of social justifications for imperialism. Why is it okay for some people to gain control of other people, right? And this brings us back to the idea of social Darwinism. You may remember how we talked about the fact that social Darwinism is used in the U.S. as a reason why some companies should gain control over other companies and, should knock them out of business, or, that one company should be a monopoly and no one should be able to compete with them. Why? Because, only the strong survive, and it should be survival of the fittest. And, if somebody's a successful businessman, it becomes because they're superior to the poor, that there's something inferior, there's something wrong with the poor people, they're not as good. Same idea with social Darwinism. It's this idea, from an imperialist standpoint, is that certain cultures are better than other cultures. That European white culture is the best, and they have a right to conquer inferior people. And that's, this kind of racist, of course, it's a racist belief and that type of thing. And those of you who had global last year, remember ideas like white man's burden and things like that. Same thing here. U.S. believed it just as much. And the other part of it is also this kind of missionary spirit. So basically, America is a Christian country, and Christians believe that they have a responsibility to spread their religion. So you get a big push for people wanting to spread Christianity all over the globe. And they're actually pretty successful. A lot of missionaries make a lot of inroads spreading Christianity to new areas of the country. All right, so like I said, for those of you who had global last year, you remember, we talked about this from the standpoint of the British and from the Europeans. But here's a picture of American imperialism and this kind of idea of social Darwinism, but it's America being the perpetrator. So here you have the figure at the front of the room, and obviously he should look familiar. That is, of course, Uncle Sam. Whenever you see that little beard and the striped pants, Uncle Sam, and who is he educating? Well, you can see in the front row, you have Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines, and the people of those countries are not pictured as mature adults. Do they look like they are, equals to Uncle Sam? No. in this political cartoon, they have them have these countries represented as children, as kind of like, and again, these kind of racist stereotypes of the, the dark faces and things like that. And it's up to Uncle Sam to, educate these guys and straighten them out and introduce, his superior way of life. So these kinds of racist, undertones and overtones is very common with imperialism and to American imperialism as well. All right. So now that we understand why you imperialize, let's talk about how America begins to imperialize. And as a first step in the 1800s, we don't so much focus on creating colonies. Our first kind of inroads into building our foreign policy towards other nations is really about developing trade relationships. Okay, so at first we're not necessarily taking on colonies, but we just got to build trade relationships. And the first area that we go to as part of our foreign policy is going to Japan. Again, those of you who had global may remember we talked about Matthew Perry. And Matthew Perry takes a ship and lands in Japan. Now, Japan at that time practiced a policy of isolationism. If you're not familiar, Japan is an island nation. It's actually an archipelago. It's made up of more than one island. But suffice to say, it is separated from the mainland of Asia, and it's off the coast of China and Korea. And so because of its geographic isolation, it was able to cut off contact with the rest of the world and have this very traditional Japanese culture and did not want any contact with outsiders. And what ends up happening is because of that, Japan kind of militarily was much more out of date. Their military was much weaker than the U.S. military at that time. So when Matthew Perry shows up with a steamship, these guys are blown away. They were still using sailboats, and he's got modern cannons that are much more powerful than anything else the Japanese had. Japanese are still fighting with samurai swords, and he's coming in there, guns blazing. Suffice to say, you'll learn about this in more detail in Global, but for the purposes of U.S., you need to understand that because of Matthew Perry, Japan opens up trade relations with the U.S. and then later with the rest of the world. But it is because of Matthew Perry and Matthew Perry busting into Japan in 1854, Japan stops being isolated and instead builds trading relationships with America and other countries. Now, in addition to Japan, after that, we get the U.S. making inroads with China. So again, for those of you who have Global, you may remember that China was a target of British imperialism, right? The British came in, and that was the whole Opium War thing. And so the British were the ones who kind of busted in the door and forced China to open up trade relations with them. And what happens is once Britain did that, other countries followed. So, he had Russia and other countries. And what happens is that these other countries developed what's called spheres of influence. You don't need to know that for U.S., but just FYI. What happens is that China, basically all these European nations had certain sections of China that were under their control from a business standpoint. What you do need to know from U.S. is when the United States sees this, that all these European nations are kind of taking different chunks of China and gaining control of it, the U.S. is concerned because the U.S. wants access to China also. For those of you taking Global 9, you may have already learned that China had products like porcelain and silk that you really couldn't get other places. So the U.S. wants to make sure it still has access to the Chinese market. And to make sure that happens, it proposes what's called the open door policy. And if you take a look at the picture, what is the open door policy? Well, it's the idea that the door to Chinese markets must remain open. That America will not be shut out of China, that America will have the opportunity to buy Chinese goods and sell American goods in China, that the Europeans will not keep America out of that market. That's the open door policy that America proposes, and that has to do with China. The other thing you can know is that America helped put down the Boxer Rebellion, so we had a lot of involvement in China as part of our foreign policy. All right, we did not have a sphere of influence in China, however, but we did have the open door policy. We did have a trade relationship with China and with Japan. All right. Then we're going to move forward. I'm going to do another quick review. This is something that we learned about earlier this year in US, and that is, if you remember, it's the thing with, I showed you a political cartoon where Uncle Sam took off his hat and threw that hat onto Latin America and said, call dibs. Do you remember that political cartoon? What did that have to do with? Who remembers when Uncle Sam threw his hat and said, Europe, no, you're not allowed to come here. I call dibs. I'm throwing my hat down. It's mine. If you remember, what was that called? It was called the Monroe Doctrine. Again, this is kind of American foreign policy. Part of this, the Monroe Doctrine in the 1800s, was where the United States said to Europe, you may not create new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Again, those of you who had global may remember that South America used to be colonies of Spain and Portugal, and these areas of Latin America had gone through revolutions to become independent. And so what happens is after these revolutions were successful, America basically stands up to Europe and says, listen, you lost these colonies, no backsies. You cannot create new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And this is called the Monroe Doctrine. Again, this is kind of early 1800s, okay? So if Europe tries to create a colony in America, America is going to see that as a threat. So that is the background to imperialism. This is the very early start of imperialism, that's all the old stuff. The starting with the new one, that's going to be new for everybody. All right, so good luck. Please, good luck with your quiz, and I'll talk to you in a bit. Bye.